My name is Diana Michelson, and I'm a 10th grader at Long Beach Polytechnic High School, and I conducted my research on Pisaster ochraceus mucus as an anti-fouling substance at the Cabrillo Marine Aquarium, and I was assisted by my mentor, Dr. Andres Carrillo. I've participated in my local science fair since 3rd grade and began competing in the LA County Science and Engineering Fair as a 6th grader. My two past science fair projects have had to do with attempting to make infrastructure more environmentally sustainable. And last year, my project on coastal concrete surface structure influence on marine settlement investigated how the surface texture of concrete infrastructure and marine development could be made more environmentally friendly via change in surface texture. And essentially, I created samples with varying textures, ranging from smooth to highly textured, as you can see in this photo. And I found that the samples that contained a more complex surface texture, in this case, the sample on the far right, had the most organism settlement. And this suggests that adding a surface complexity to marine infrastructure could indeed reduce the ecological footprint associated with marine development. During my research, my mentor and I discussed that while there are times when marine settlement should be encouraged, marine settlement is also highly undesirable in many cases, such as the shipping industry. Over the last 2 years, as I've conducted my research at the Cabrillo Marine Aquarium, I've driven across the LA and Long Beach ports on a weekly basis. And every time I pass over these immense man made waterways, I see hundreds of commercial vessels unloading billions of dollars worth of cargo. And as this Pacific Ocean is exactly where my family swims over the summer, I was really concerned because it was well known that the water quality of these ports directly affects local marine environments. And as one of the most toxic components of the port is copper that is leached out of anti fouling paints, I wanted to aim my research to mitigate these harmful effects created by these copper paints and find a more environmentally sustainable anti fouling paint. Marine fouling is the natural accumulation of bacteria and organisms on a submerged structure. And you can see this on the picture on the right, which depicts biofouling on a ship's hull. And there are many issues associated with biofouling, especially for the shipping industry, because fouling can decrease a ship's speed by 10% and an increase drag by 60%, all which result in an increase of fuel intake. Biofouling on a ship's hull is also often responsible for the introduction of invasive species, which can endanger a region's biodiversity. And currently, copper based anti fouling paints are the most common defense against marine settlement, as they are purposely designed to be toxic. However, these paints result in the toxic water quality, and this copper biocide in these paints is an algicide, meaning that it limits the amount of algae production and can negatively affect a region's biodiversity. Additionally, this biocide has been seen to have negative impacts on specific organisms such as sea scallops and fathead minnows, because it reduces the sperm and egg production in these organisms. And as this copper biocide leaches into the environment, this copper paint can also deter marine accumulation. Although researchers are experimenting with less invasive anti fouling solutions, such as creating super slick surfaces and ultrasonic waves, these are typically significantly more expensive and still require the use of copper based paints. And so the goal of my research was to find a more environmentally sustainable alternative to traditional and toxic copper based anti fouling paints. And I came across a research paper written by Dr. David Phillips. And in his research, Phillips found that the mere presence of Seastar chemicals secreted by a predatory sea star resulted in the defensive behavior by the sea star's prey, sea urchins and sea snails. And essentially, in his research, sea urchins and sea snails would try to avoid and escape water that contained sea star mucus. I aimed to apply Phillips' research to determine if the mucus secreted by Pisaster ochraceus, or commonly known as the purple sea star, have anti-fouling properties that can be used to reduce organism settlement and potentially replace traditional copper-based anti-fouling paints. I predicted that the presence of the Pisaster ochraceus mucus would help deter fouling communities, because the sea star is a keystone species in the Pacific Ocean that preys on many fouling organisms, such as mussels, limpets, and barnacles. And I also believe that increasing the potency of the sea star chemicals would further result in a decrease in marine settlement. At the Cabrillo Marine Aquarium's research facility, I began by placing the Pisaster ochraceus sea star in 1 liter of still seawater. And it was key to have this seawater still, because the sea star naturally secretes mucus when it is in still seawater to prevent its skin from drying out in case the water evaporates. And so I collected 250 milliliters of water from this bucket at 1, 3, and 4.5 hours. And then I also collected a sample of control seawater, meaning that there was no sea star presence. And then I mix these treatments with a 4% low melting point agar mixture and pour the combined agar and seawater mixtures into a petri dish. And the goal here was that while the 1, 3, and 4.5 hour exposures all contained Seastar presence, the 3 and 4.5 hour exposures were most potent with Seastar mucus. And so then I deployed these samples at a boat launching dock at the Cabrillo Beach in San Pedro, California. And these samples were suspended off the dock for 2 weeks over the span of 2 months. I then took these samples to my home because the research facility was closed due to COVID-19 restrictions and analyzed them under a dissecting microscope. And 1 month into deploying my samples, I actually had a very serious sport injury where I broke both ankles. So I was really lucky to have my family help me with deploying and collecting my samples while I was wheelchair bound. There was a trend observed amongst most groups in which the control or 0 hour exposure had the most organism settlement, followed by the 1 hour exposure and then the 3 and 4.5 hour treatments. In fact, on average, the control had double the settlement of the 4.5 hour treatment and triple that of the 3 hour treatment. On average, the control also had more settlement when compared to the 1 hour treatment. And after conducting a nested ANOVA, one-way ANOVA, and Tuckey's HSD test, I found that the only statistically significant treatment was a 3 hour exposure. But regardless, I also noticed that the presence of the sea star mucus resulted in settlement of smaller organisms, which suggests that the presence of sea star chemicals actually delays the process of biofouling. On samples that contained the sea star presence, I also noticed the residing organisms were inactive and would not respond to physical stimulus. My hypothesis is supported by my data, as there's a promising trend in which the presence of sea star mucus has the potential to deter organisms. And what I found most interesting was that while there were great differences among the settlement along my 4 treatments, the actual potency of the sea star mucus was fairly low. So, for example, the 1 hour treatment had 1 hour of sea star exposure diluted in 1 liter of water, and the 3 hour treatment had 3 hours of sea star exposure diluted in 750 milliliters of water. And yet, these low concentrations were enough to result in significantly less marine accumulation as compared to the control treatment. My research suggests that increasing the sea star mucus concentration likely result in even less biofouling. And this is really big because it means that if we were able to pinpoint this chemical being released by the sea star and recreate it in a lab, it is highly likely that it would be able to serve as an anti-fouling solution and replace traditional copper-based paints. And so these sea star chemicals have the potential to be applied to a paint base and then be applied to ship hulls. Also, the sea star mucus could also be used in conjunction with other non biocide anti fouling methods such as ultrasonic waves and hard paints. Thank you, and here are my works cited.